Okay, now we get into the more interesting graphs. How does this 2 affect the graph? How does this half affect the graph? And how does this plus 2 affect the graph? Well, I'll tell you. So to begin with, think about the graph of cosine. So it starts at 1, it goes down to -1, and then it goes back up. And this goes from 0 to 2 pi on the x-axis. Okay, this is the basic graph. Now this is just for y equals cosine of x. And it on the x-axis, it takes from 0 to 2 pi to draw one complete cycle until it gets back up to the top. So that means that the period is equal to 2 pi. And if you measure on the y-axis from the middle up to the top of the graph, that's called the amplitude, and that's equal to 1. And you can measure from the middle to the top, or you can measure from the middle to the bottom. It's still an amplitude of 1. Now what this half right here does is it's going to cut that in half. So instead of going up to 1, it'll only go up to a half. And instead of going to -1, it'll only go to -1/2. What about this 2 though? So what that basically means is that if you were to look at the graph from 0 to 2 pi, this 2 means that you have to draw the graph twice. So that means you have to make this shape twice. So it would make one of them right here, and then it would make another one right here. But I only need to graph one cycle of it. So I just need to go from 0 to pi. Okay, now a shortcut, instead of having to do all of that and that and that, a shortcut is the period is going to be, the original period is 2 pi, and then you divide by whatever this number is. So you divide by 2. And when you reduce, that's pi. So that little formula right there replaced me doing this and all of this, because it's basically telling me you go from 0 to pi, and then that's going to be one cycle of the graph. The amplitude is whatever number is in front. Now if it happens to be a negative, just take off the negative. Amplitude is always measured as a positive. Just like my height, 5'10", well, if I was standing on my head and I was upside down, you would still say it's a height of 5'10". You wouldn't say -5'10". So that's what amplitude does. And then this is going to shift the whole graph up. So if you take this and you shift it up by 2, sorry, that's probably off the screen, but you shift it up by 2, that's called the vertical shift. So you could just leave it as a +2, or you could emphasize it by saying it's going to go up by 2. Now this is about the x-axis, and this is about the y-axis. So as far as the x-axis, the period is pi, so it's going to go from 0 to pi. And then I always like to cut this in half. In the middle is pi over 2. All right, I'm done with the x-axis information. For the y-axis, well, I like to do this first, the amplitude. So that means that it would go from -1/2 to +1/2. Second, do the vertical shift. So now this 1/2 needs to be shifted up by 2. So add 2 and we'll get 2.5. And this one also needs to be shifted up by 2. So add 2 And that would be 2 minus a half is 1.5. So I don't really have enough room right there. Let me redraw it real fast. The x-axis has this information. And then let's see, this 2 minus a half is 1.5, which you could write as 1.5 or 1.5 or 3 halves. And this would be 2.5. And then we need to draw the graph. Well, to make the graph more accurate, what I do is it's going to have to be between this line and this line. Also, it's going to have to stop at pi, and this is the middle, and this is where it starts. And if you want to be even more accurate, then cut that in half so that you have 4 rectangles. Just ignore that little extra line right there. And then we're graphing cosine. So you have to take this basic shape right here and fit it in this box. So it would start at the top. By the middle, it would go down to the bottom. And then it would go back up to the top. And that is my graph. Now, check the answer. So go to y equals, and the original function was 2 plus 1/2 cosine of 2x. Now for something extremely important. Set up the window on the calculator just like this window right here. So this red box. So you go to window, and for x's it goes from 0 to pi. So 0 to pi. And the scale is pi over 2, which is good because that's pi over 2. For the y values, it's going to go from 1.5 as a minimum to 2.5. So when I graph it, it's only going to show me this window. So that means all I should see is this black graph. So it'd start at the top, dip down, touch the bottom, yes, go back up, and finish. Perfect. So if I had gotten it wrong, let me just change one of these numbers, 0.5. So let's say that I didn't do the math right there correctly and I got a 0.5. Then it would look like this. And that has this big gap. But if you look at the rectangle, so just look inside the rectangle itself, there is no gap. It hits the bottom of the rectangle. So this should have hit the bottom of the screen, and it didn't. And it's because I mistyped this number right here. Then it's perfect.